Hello everyone, welcome back to another mini album reviews video. My name is Simon, and I got 10 albums that I want to talk about today, all in short form reviews. Although, these ones are a little bit longer than most of my mini reviews have been recently. I've kind of just accepted at this point the fact that in some of my mini review videos, they'll be just somewhat brief, like they are today, and other times they'll be super brief. But that's the thing with mini reviews, I mean, they can't be too long anyway. So I'm not going to waste any more time, I'm going to get right into talking about the albums, but as always I will just say, it's just my opinion on these albums. I'm not trying to be objective about anything, I just want to make that clear. A lot of the time I feel like maybe I'm being a bit too harsh on albums that maybe I just don't understand, or maybe they're just not for me, right? But at the end of the day, I'm just telling you how I feel about these albums. A lot of it's based on my interpretations and just the way that I experience the music. So, as always, let me know what you think in the comment section down below if you'd like to. And yeah, without further ado, let's get right into the reviews. This is my third experience with the Saidan album, following 2022's absolutely exceptional Onryo 2, Her Spirit Eternal, which stands as one of my favorite albums of the 2020s without question, and 2024's weaker but still great visual kill, The Blossoming of Psychotic Depravity, which I admittedly haven't gone back to a whole lot, but after re-listening to it recently, I'm a little bit surprised I haven't, as I think it still holds up quite well. So for those of you who don't know, Saidan are a melodic black metal duo from Nashville who were formed earlier this decade, and while I still haven't heard their debut, I will at some point, those two albums that I know are some of the most heartbreaking black metal you'll hear this decade, with lyrics that I'm pretty sure are about generational trauma and cycles of abuse, as well as some mysterious figures that the narrator misses, and when you potentially connect the dots of everything that's being said, it could go a lot deeper. And the music really helps the emotion shine through, which absolutely does not lead to easy listening, but is incredibly powerful, and I was absolutely looking forward to this new album. And I hate to say it, but this just isn't quite hitting for me in the ways that those two albums did. And it's quite disappointing considering just how hyped I was for this album. And what's even more frustrating is that this follows a lot of the same formula as those albums. It's very melodic, where the melodies and the instrumentation complement the harsh vocals and really bring out the tunefulness in the final product, and the music is just as intense as ever. The Bandcamp description for this album actually says it's continuing a concept that's been on multiple albums, and that this album follows the story of a student who struggles to find her worth far away from her home, and eventually becomes the victim of a cult. It also mentions that this is largely about the lead singer Splatterpunk's struggles with depression, and for his own sake, I hope this was the album that he needed to write. My critiques here are in no way meant as an attack on him or the band, rather explaining why this isn't quite clicking for me. I mean, that can be said about any of these reviews in this video. But before we get there, I do think the lyrics are quite strong. Maybe not quite to the extent of their best, but still heartbreaking nonetheless. Whether it be the submission that's likely stained with a sense of hopelessness and potentially a lack of choice on Kara no Bara, the stark imagery showing the narrator being pulled into the cult on ethereal blood that feels like a real-life horror movie drenched in fantasy elements, or the absolutely devastating violence on Womb of Hatred, where the narrator is either being killed or killing someone, or maybe just watching someone die, and the role that each character plays feels intentionally unclear to accentuate the feeling of lost hopes and dreams to never come back. It also just so happens that that song has some of the best music on the album too. And on that note, look, a lot of the fundamentals of this band that I like are here, but my main issue on this album is the production and mixing. As on an album where the emotional resonance is such a huge part of the appeal, I have a hard time wrapping my head around why this sounds so foggy. It just doesn't have the same impact as I was expecting, and it's a real shame despite some pretty strong writing and performances. Now, that said, I do have other nitpicks as well, such as the occasional musical moment that feels a bit unnecessary that just doesn't really move this forward, and as much as I like the lyrics, it does lack the same truly jaw-dropping moments that I've come to expect from Saidan. Although a lot of it might be more that the music just cannot complement it quite as well, even if I don't think that this really compares to Onryo 2 Her Spirit Eternal in any way. And back on the topic of the music, my other big complaint here is that a lot of the snares feel way too clunky, when they are not totally buried in the mix. It really holds this back from being a lot harder hitting than it is, and again, it's just really unfortunate because I was super excited about this album. So as a result, I do still want to make it clear that this is absolutely a good album, and honestly, I'll give it a strong 7 out of 10 because I think it's pretty damn close to great, but I unfortunately don't think it quite gets there, and again, it's very disappointing for me to be saying this. I'm hoping they'll bounce back on their next album. I'm sure they can if the production is a bit cleaner. In the meantime, this will still do the job if you're looking for some heavy, emotional black metal, just not quite clicking for me as much as I really thought that it would. Alright, so I was going to intentionally keep this one very brief, in part because I don't even know where to start with an album like this. I ended up having a tiny bit more to say about it than I initially thought, but still not a whole lot, and it's mostly just talking around the album rather than directly reviewing it. So for those of you who don't know, Leroy is a side project of Jane Remover, an artist I've never been a huge fan of, but I figured I'd give this critically acclaimed album under a different name a try. I mean, I knew that they'd released some albums under this name and have gotten a lot of acclaim, and I thought maybe it would be quite different from a lot of Jane Remover material. What I didn't know was that this is a mashup album. It doesn't seem like most places that I've seen this album described are really calling it that, so I was very much caught off guard, and I'm not sure I've ever really reviewed a mashup album. I mean, yeah, heavy sampling is a thing in music, including a lot that I've reviewed, and maybe there is some original material here beyond the Jane Remover songs and songs by Leroy and their other side project Venturing that are sampled on this album. I'm not entirely sure. Honestly, I don't know, and I'm not about to try and go through the work of finding the origins of every moment on this album, so I don't know if there's other original material aside from their own songs that they were sampling here. Again, I'm not sure. And I do recognize some of the samples from some other songs, but again, I don't know where everything on this album came from. And there's a wide range of artists sampled, including Olivia Rodrigo, Britney Spears, Knocked Loose, and even Underscores. Although I do find it kind of funny that the song EXO Tour Life does not sample EXO Tour Life by Lil Uzi Vert. And it almost feels like a completely different art form than most music that I listen to, which makes it hard to properly review in the same way. But I guess I can try, and to be honest, I'm not really enjoying this a whole lot. And I've heard mashup music that I like, even if it's not something that I listen to a whole lot, but this just feels like it's trying to do as many things as possible without really making the songs feel like well-crafted art, more just throwing shit at a wall to see what sticks. And honestly, it makes me pretty confused as to why this has been getting so much acclaim. Whatever your opinion on mashup music is, I just have a hard time understanding someone actively choosing to listen to this. Part of me says it's because of the artist that's making it, but it's also a side project from the artist's main critically acclaimed work. And JPEG Mafia recently proved that you can be a super critically acclaimed artist and then suddenly have an album that those same critics don't like. So I guess if you can tell me if there's anything that I'm missing here, sure, go ahead. I definitely am very confused about this album. I think I gotta give this a 5 out of 10, and even then I'm probably only rating it that high because it samples some songs that I like, which make this a little bit easier to listen to. It's not getting any points for artistic value, at least from me. I've enjoyed some Jane Remover music, even if I wouldn't necessarily call myself a big fan. This, on the other hand, it's bordering on being a headache. I saw a lot of critical acclaim for this new album from Kelsey Lu, an artist I'd never heard of before, as far as I can remember. And it turns out they're a singer and cellist, with this being their second studio album to date, more than 7 years after their debut. And listening to this album, I can't say I'm all that shocked that it's been so long, because this feels like a very carefully crafted album, and it's hard to fully explain why. I'm no music expert as much as I often like to pose as one, but it's got a sound and style that I hear in a lot of albums, many of which have more rough edges and don't feel quite as perfected as this album does. And while I don't actually think this album is perfect, it feels like it's designed to be. So, for context, what kind of music is this? Well, that's kinda hard to say. It's very slow and mellow, most of the time at least, where the magic is in a lot of the subtle details. I guess I'd probably say it's art pop, but that's also quite vague. It's nothing too blatantly avant-garde in its experimentation, but it does have some songs run longer than more typical pop versions of said songs probably would have been if that was the direction that this had been aimed instead. And it's not super accessible, although it likely will appeal to a pop audience, part of the reason I use quotation marks. And I think this actually does a pretty damn good job of making the subtle details in the production really amplify the emotional core of this album. It is a bit of a tricky one to fully untangle because there is a lot of lyrical ambiguity, which I find quite intriguing on this album. I've got more to say on lyrical ambiguity later in this video, and it's not as positive, but this album really nails the right vibe in the music to support the lyrical themes, and just enough of it shines through clearly that it leaves the listener to fill in the blanks in a really fascinating way. There very much seems to be a bit of a story going on throughout the album about unhealthy relationships, where the narrator often doesn't feel worthy of being with a specific person, but it's often left unclear what the specific circumstances are. It's often implied that the narrator feels mistreated by this person, and yet they're also engaging in some tactics that might be emotionally harmful in the long run. It seems like they're both being used, and the ways that the morals and potentially self-punishment by the conscience just wash over the narrator, even if it's only subtly implied, feels very emotionally real when paired with such hazy production that shows how much the narrator might be haunted by their own actions, even if it might have all been the right thing to do, unless it wasn't. How do you balance handing out justifiable consequence with avoiding hypocrisy? Honestly, this album, in my opinion, deals with moral uncertainty a lot better than another album I'll talk about later in this video, because it feels way more focused, even if the details are left open to interpretation. I really like the moment of noticing the self-awareness the narrator needs to have about this quick-moving relationship on What Can I Do? Where the subtle warnings are there that this maybe isn't a good idea, but when it's so hard to know what's real in terms of human emotion, especially because it's often so unstable, it leaves the narrator in a tricky position, left asking the question that became the song's title. I also think the album opener, Reaper, starts the album in a bit of a potentially misleading way, where you might think it's about sin in the biblical sense and trying to navigate how to justify it, and yet, to me, it feels a lot different when placed in context with the rest of the album, as it could be the moment the narrator is put in a vulnerable situation and potentially taken advantage of a little, all starting the back and forth destruction, where the mostly happy-sounding melodies of this song might set up the illusion that everything's great, because that's how it appears on the surface. And the following portrait of a lady on fire feels very unlike anything I've heard recently, and I mean that as a huge compliment, as it goes to some pretty dark places about the burning desire sung about here, as if it represents some larger, deeper desire the narrator has. Where the line, "Do you ever get like this, I wonder?" is haunting in ways that are hard to even describe unless you hear the song. It's a subtly very impactful song. And I could talk about some of the moments that seem a bit simpler, like the addictive qualities of the relationship and how it makes the narrator feel, which are sung about on Running to Pain. Really nice melodies on that track. And the aftermath of it all on Cutting Off the Head of a Ghost, which might be the closest thing the narrator finds to peace on this album, because they recognize that the breakup means it's going to be in the past, and maybe it's not worth worrying about, even if the pain is still there on both sides. And the album doesn't confirm that everything's fine. It depends what truths you're willing to accept, whether you should or not. But the song that feels most important to this album's lyrical arc, even if not my absolute personal favorite song here, although it is probably one of them, is Better Than That, which honestly casts a lot of those other songs I mentioned in a particular light, which led me to come up with a lot of these interpretations that I did for the overall lyrical themes on this album. Again, whether or not I'm right is another question, but this song feels like the biggest moment of self-reflection, where they say that they're not going to stay in this relationship because they're better than that. But that could represent a lot of different things. Are they realizing their own worth, or do they think that they've fucked up seriously and need to be better than they were and give the other person their space? And honestly, it might be both things. And whether or not you agree with my lyrical analysis of this album, I hope you can agree with me that the production is fucking fantastic. A lot of this was handled by Jack Antonoff, who I think has had mixed results for me in his production journey, but the smoky, atmospheric hollowness of so many of these songs just oozes with emotion that feels so well designed for this album. And it might be the most I've liked a Jack Antonoff produced album that I've heard since Lord's Melodrama in 2017. And as good as the production on that album is, it's mostly the songwriting and vocals that really put it in a tier of its own. That's absolutely no shade to the songwriting of this album, though, but it is some of Jack Antonoff's best production that I've heard, and it's also no discredit to any of the other producers here either. I can't wait to hear more music from Kelsey Lu, even if it takes another 7 years, and I might have to check out that debut as well, because this is legitimately great. It's an 8 out of 10 for me. I would say believe the hype for this one. This is a new studio album from country singer-songwriter River Shook, and I believe it's their first album under this name after playing with multiple bands. And I've seen generally positive reviews for this online, and thus I was pretty intrigued about hearing it. And after giving it multiple listens all the way through, well, it's a bit of an interesting one to fully grapple with my opinion on, at least in the way that I can really put into words for a review. Because in a lot of ways, this feels like the kind of country music that I really like, It's on the more thoughtful, emotional side of country music, and also brings the right kind of energy to some of the more upbeat tunes, and it's the kind of stylistic diversity of tone throughout the album that I find quite appealing. The problem is that the album's a bit of a mess, and I don't mean that it's bad, more so that it's extremely inconsistent, often with underwhelming production and unfortunately a lot of tracks that feel like filler. I will also make the critique that I wish the songs felt a little bit more connected together, but in saying that, I've also got to mention that I do appreciate the variety of themes discussed on this album, such as the emotional closing track about not being appreciated by one's parents, the more straightforward love songs like Country Angel and If We Got a Chance, the former of which is more about appreciating the little things that lead to infatuation. I guess Blue Vervain is kind of similar in that regard, and the latter of which is more of a making things right song following a breakup. And also cutting out toxic people from your life on Fading, which may be about a partner or an acquaintance, it's not really clear. Point is, there's a lot of different topics here, it's not badly written at all, and while I wish the lyrics maybe had a bit more unique perspectives on these topics, again, it's not bad writing. So when I say that I wish it all connected together more, it's hard to fully explain, but it is a nitpick and isn't a big issue that ruins the album. I just think it could have been a bit more compelling as a full project if it were tied together more in some way, because stylistically this very much feels like, I'm not going to say a concept album, but the sort of album you'd expect to be making some larger point. Is that an unfair criticism? Likely it is, yeah, but it's just my opinion, and thus I think I should get to my bigger issue, which is the production, especially a lot of the really clunky snares that don't fit at all on songs like Lost Without Your Love and Country Angel, and so many really rough guitar timbres that don't have the grit to make these songs really kick ass, and more just distracts from a lot of the elements that do work. And said elements are not really consistent, any of them. Yeah, I like a lot of the melodies, and there are some good hooks, but there are also a lot that feel really meandering or just hitting awkward notes. And on a similar note, the vocals can often be a little bit grating when awkwardly paired with some of the instrumentation, even though I do sometimes really like Rivers' vocals on this album. Honestly, pretty much every individual element that goes into making this album is inconsistent on this project in terms of quality. As a whole, it leads to a 6 out of 10, and as much as I see some potential here, I wouldn't say I'd be super optimistic about future albums from River Shook. Just because there's potential doesn't mean I believe it'll lead to better music. But still, this isn't bad, it's not close to great either, but it's decent, and there's enough likable songs with strong enough highlights for me to moderately recommend this if you're a fan of country music. And it is really a shame that this didn't click for me more, because it seems so up my alley, and I really wanted to be able to genuinely praise it, which I guess I can to a small extent. Kind of a weird listen for me from a critic's perspective. I guess you can make of it what you will. One of my favorite ambient albums of 2026 thus far is Rafael Anton Irisarri's Points of Inaccessibility. I talked about it in a mini review back in April, and every time I've listened to it since then, it's had the same magic that it did at first. It was overflowing with feelings of nostalgia for me, and just felt so calming and comforting at the same time. So obviously I was going to be curious to hear this album from him, a collaboration with Abul Mogard, I hope I pronounced that correctly, whom I don't really know much about, but apparently is another ambient artist who seems quite critically acclaimed, and obviously this was enough to make me interested to hear this album. And just like Points of Inaccessibility, this is not an album I'd recommend if you're not a fan of ambient music. It's very much based on long, drawn-out synth drones, where the changes happen very slowly and very subtly, and it almost feels like it's designed to accompany some visual art piece, which I don't think it was, but it certainly has that feeling to it. And personally, this isn't a style of music that I'm always really into, but Rafael Anton Irisarri won me over with that other album this year, and unfortunately, while I am still enjoying this new one, it's not quite resonating with me as much. And it's kind of hard to explain or give deep, thoughtful analysis considering how simple this album is on the surface. There's likely a lot more to it, but I just don't have the knowledge of what goes into making this kind of mellow ambient music to properly go through all the little details. I mean, it's probably not an album designed for critical analysis. I will say, though, that it's likely just something about the timbres of these drones which aren't quite evoking the same feeling for me. I mean, the album's not really about individual moments, but I don't think it's got the right timbres consistently enough to really come together for me as a full project. I actually enjoyed the first two tracks quite a bit because they were simpler and really made the subtler details stand out more, and it's something that I do admire a lot in ambient music where artists can do so much with so little. But then on the third and fourth tracks, it feels maybe like they were just trying to do a bit too much with it, And it's not that I'm against variety in this kind of music. In fact, it can really help a lot of the time. But this album's best moments do have subtle changes that make a big difference, and it's just not always flashy and in your face. Not that any of this album is really flashy and in your face, but maybe it just hits a bit of a weird middle ground. And then the final two songs just feel kind of like weaker versions of the first two, even though they are mostly effective for this album. So overall, if you really like ambient music, this is probably worth checking out, and for someone like me who's kind of an ambient fan, it's albums like these that do really give me more of an appreciation for the genre. But this isn't like the new Boards of Canada album, which fans of pretty much all genres seemingly united to say their praiseful words for. And while I'd argue this album might be better, it's a much subtler and introspective kind of ambient music. And honestly, I think it works quite well as a result, which is why I'm going to give this a 7 out of 10. But I'd be lying if I said I expect to go back to this much. I might get curious and hopefully relive the subtle magic that is here, but there isn't as much of it as you might hope. I was quite surprised when I saw just how much critical acclaim Madonna's new album was getting. And I'm not sure I should have been. She is an absolutely iconic pop star, and it's her first album in 7 years, which is her longest gap between albums in her entire career. And it's been a decade full of people making throwback music, calling back to earlier decades, so maybe a return to form would make sense. But speaking of confessions, I think I have a few important ones to make in talking about all this. The first and smaller one is that I didn't even know this was coming out until after it was already released and I saw all the acclaim. Or maybe I did and just forgot about it, I'm not sure. But either way, I wasn't thinking about this very much. And secondly, also more significant a thing to mention here, I'm not very familiar with Madonna's discography. Yeah, I obviously know some of her classic songs, and I've heard one or two of her early albums, but I can't really compare this to her classics. Yeah, I guess I could have done the full discography dive, but I've been busy enough with other things, and I've been considering revisiting Shoo Shoo's discography in preparation for their new David Lynch tribute album, although I still haven't decided if I'm going to review it or not, because I don't know if it really fits the typical kind of album that I review. Or if I do, I might not even go through their full discography first. It might not make sense. I haven't figured out what I'm doing there. Anyway, I decided not to listen through all of Madonna's albums, although I will hopefully do that in the future at some point. But I can still give my personal thoughts on this new album, which actually doesn't sound a whole lot like classic Madonna, and yet has been getting significantly more acclaim than probably any album she's released in the past 2 decades. And while I can't compare it to those albums as I have not listened to them, I am quite enjoying this new record. Now, with that, I'll also mention this is far from perfect. It's also over an hour long, which doesn't really feel justified when the album has a bit of an inconsistency problem, and some tracks do tend to drag on a bit longer than they need to with all the repetition, which I kinda hate to say because this is largely a house album, which is a genre that often relies on repetition and getting lost in the vibe. So why isn't this clicking for me more? Well, part of it is that I don't think the production fully hits the vibe all the time. And I might have been able to look past it a bit if these songs progressed in a bit more of an impactful way, but it's hard to properly get lost in the vibe when the grooves sound underpowered and washed out by goopy synths that don't enhance the fun dance floor anthems and also distract from the more laid-back vibes of some softer house songs. And it's a real shame because there's a lot of moments here that could have gone a lot harder. I really like the songwriting and performance of Dance Ethereal, but the vocals sound too drowned out in the mix. One Step Away is a really pretty song, but the bass feels too underpowered. I also like a lot of elements of the penultimate track, The Test, but the busy percussion is way too distracting. And all of this is not even to mention the clunky percussion and awful vocal production, including some pitch shifting on Read My Lips, which also has a really awkward genre switch partway through. And speaking of the vocal production, it's another issue I have with a lot of this album. When her vocals are not incredibly processed, I think Madonna really takes command of a lot of these songs and she sounds great. But in so many moments, the vocal effects really take away from the power of these songs, like the opener, I Feel So Free, Everything, which also has some really rough synth timbres that do not fit the song at all, and School also has some strange vocal effects that don't flatter it. There's also Betrayal, which is a pretty good song, but should be way better, and would have been if the vocal production didn't sound like such a contrast from the song, which actually has some beautiful production otherwise, and some really nice touches of piano. And overall, a lot of my critiques come back to me overall liking the vision of this record, but the execution not always working as well as it could. And I'll acknowledge the best hooks still pop off, and there's enough here that I like so I can mostly praise this album. And I'm realizing I haven't even talked much about the lyrics, which are mostly pretty simple. I mean, it is pop music at the end of the day, it's usually not meant to be super deep, and while I don't think this album really is at all, with the occasional exceptions, such as Fragile, which is a beautiful song about the death of her brother, although even it is pretty simple in its writing, and is very emotional as a result, still, I think she mostly captures the right vibe on a lot of these songs, in the performances and the compositions, a lot of which are about feeling free and letting yourself have a good time. Again, it's just a shame that the final product doesn't have as much feeling to it as it could. Although I think Bizarre actually does a pretty damn great job of painting a picture where the narrator is feeling pulled toward a toxic relationship, because the production and music actually work together to make this go pretty hard and have that sense of drama. So yeah, I guess make of all this what you will. I'll give it credit for some good melodies too on songs like the aforementioned Bizarre, as well as Love Without Words, Good for the Soul, as well as others. And it is reminding me I would like to listen to all her albums at some point. As for this one, I haven't listened to the classics, so I can't compare it to them or rank it in her discography, but judging this album on its own, I think it's a pretty good release, just also overly long and absolutely held back by flaws that leave me thinking about the fact that I've heard better synthpop and house albums than this that aim for a similar vibe and I just personally think succeed a lot better. Still, I do sort of understand why this is getting so much acclaim. I can see the appeal and I'll give it a 7 out of 10, but I would not recommend going into it with the highest of expectations. If you don't, then you might end up being pleasantly surprised like I was. I'm quite late to this one due to this album being originally released exclusively as a physical record. And look, I don't like that so many big companies are going all digital entirely, and I am a bit of a record collector myself, but I like to be careful about not spending too much money on vinyls, and especially when I wasn't even sure if I was going to like this album, I figured it would probably just be a waste of money and effort. So I was going to just skip over this album, but now it's been released on streaming, so I'm skipping the deluxe tracks and just discussing the 9-song original edition of this album. And just for context, in case any of you missed the first Johnny Blue Skies album, Johnny Blue Skies is a new stage name for Sturgill Simpson, this being his second album under this name, following 2024's Passage du Désir, which I considered revisiting in preparation for this review, but I'm not sure I'm in the right headspace to really analyze it in the way that I'd like to. That album is a lot to take in, and also because I only got so much time, but what I can say is this new album is honestly quite underwhelming. There's just not a whole lot in the way of melodies or interesting hooks that really make this stand out. I am admittedly a bit of a tough sell on this kind of bouncy, peppy groove, slow dance country music. I cannot think of a good genre description for it, which feels weird to say because I really love country music, although I guess maybe that's more in comparison to other kinds of country rather than just music in general. I'm not really sure. I'm not about to study all those analytics right now. But this album very much has a balance of sillier songs and more serious songs, and they don't really feel connected or pieced together on the album in a way that feels cohesive or that really justifies the weird contrasts. And it also doesn't help when so much of the writing feels so underwhelming, where I can understand what he's trying to do, but I just don't think it works. For example, I can respect that Excited Delirium is an anti-police brutality / anti-ICE song, but it feels like the most basic version of that, and the upbeat instrumentation doesn't fit at all for what he's trying to do here lyrically. I have similar issues with the closing track, Ain't That a Bitch, which points out a lot of problems in society, but doesn't really go any deeper, and it's really just a wallow without the proper instrumentation or vibe to really make me feel this song. Even if the musical build-up toward the end is pretty enjoyable from a purely musical standpoint, not taking in any extra context of the rest of the album or anything. And then you have some of the sillier moments that just feel kind of overly stupid, like Situation. And then there's a song like Stay On That, which is about the cringiest sex song you can imagine, where the bouncy, upbeat country instrumentation feels really weird for this vibe, and the lyrics are very corny. And look, I get that it's meant to be a silly sex song rather than a sexy one, and that's not something I'm against in music. I'm one of those people who actually liked Wood on Taylor Swift's album last year. But it's not particularly funny or interesting and just relies too much on annoying repetition. It's the kind of song that can be really obnoxious when not done right, and I think this song is a total mess. I guess I did kind of enjoy the opener, Make America Fuck Again, but I typically enjoy this album when it's being a little bit less in your face and feels a bit more classic country, if that makes any sense. I'm talking about songs like Viridescent and Don't Let Go, although I'd probably struggle to call any individual song here great. I guess I just gotta hope some of them grow on me. Now, to this album's credit, as much as the production does sound a little messy, I honestly don't mind it because it feels in a lot of ways like listening to a vinyl. I guess I might understand why he originally just released this as a physical album. And he's a pretty good singer, even though I don't always love his vocal performances on every song. But I don't know, something's just not quite clicking here, and it's especially frustrating in moments where it feels difficult to properly justify my complaints, like the penultimate track, Everyone is Welcome, which has some interesting commentary on growing older and changing your mindsets in life, including the very devastating line, hard to start over when the end is near. And yet the song just isn't hitting in the way that I feel like it should, even though on paper it's doing a lot of things right in the lyrics and the instrumentation and production. So I guess the album's just not really for me. I can sort of see why some people are so hyped about it, as in a lot of ways I think it does what it's trying to do quite well, sometimes. But I found some of this to be kind of insufferable, and while most of it is mildly enjoyable, and thus I'll give this a 6 out of 10, I don't think I'll be going back to it much. And while I am curious to check out more Sturgill Simpson albums, I've been meaning to do that for a while, not sure when I'll get to it. But yeah, this album is pretty mediocre, all things considered. I actually don't remember how I found this album, even though it was pretty recent. Anyways, this was actually released back in February, and it's some power metal from a band I'd never heard of. They're from Tokyo, and this is their 5th studio album thus far. I haven't listened to any of their other albums, and I'm not really a huge power metal fan, so I didn't want to set my expectations too high for this. And that was probably the right idea, because while I can totally see how there might be an audience for this, and it's quite impressive from a technical standpoint, I'm not really loving this album, and it goes beyond my personal lack of ability to get into a lot of power metal. Because the production can be a little lacking in real impact, and it also doesn't help that this album is over an hour. Because while there are some good melodies and strong intensity, and some of the vocals are pretty powerful, even if other times I don't find the singing to really be my favorite, for an album that keeps the same style and sound pretty consistent without really bringing a ton of variety to make individual songs stand out that much, an hour of this just gets a little bit tiring. And this does also bring me to talking about the lyrics, which honestly feel pretty typical for this kind of music, with lots of lines about pushing forward and living life the best you can while fighting against fucked up systems, and using a lot of pretty generic imagery in sending those messages. I'm not going to say it's embarrassingly cliche or anything, but it's honestly kind of bordering on it. It just kind of fits a bit more because, well, it's power metal. It doesn't make the album worth praising significantly, but it's fine, I guess. Now, there are definitely some strong moments on this album. I quite like Blazing Halo with its great grooves and real dramatic instrumentation that's both impressive and cohesive, probably my favorite song on the album. I'll also give some credit to the pretty cool guitar solo on the opening track, The Castaway. Wheels on Fire has some good intensity to it, and I think the production is at least slightly better on this track than most of this album. And I guess I'll praise the vocal melodies on The Eve of Change, even if that is one of many moments here where something just feels a little bit off in the production and it prevents it from hitting a lot harder. That song also has a pretty good guitar solo, though. And you know what? Even if I don't like the penultimate track's lyrics, like Without You, the Whole World is Gone, which just feel overly melodramatic without the correct musical framing or vibe to really own it, and I also think the snares sound quite a bit underpowered on that song, the huge soaring vocals paired with the guitar is quite nice and leads to a pretty good song overall that builds musically quite well, even if the issues that I have with it keep it from being among my favorites, even on this underwhelming album. Now, just to make a random observation, I don't know if this is just me, but does Phoenix Rises Again kind of sound like if Spelling tried to make a metal song? Yes, I know that sounds totally wild, but it's the best way I can describe the song, which is unfortunately not one of my favorite tracks here, but I wanted to mention it for this reason. But this song does also suffer from a pretty weak hook, which is honestly an issue I have with the album overall, where a lot of it just feels pretty straightforward for power metal, and I'm just not finding any big reason to go back to this. In fact, I'll likely forget this even came out, and it's not to say that this is a bad record, because I don't think it is. It's just very much not for me, and even with that being said, I have heard this kind of thing done better, in my opinion. And again, when this sounds so flattened by underwhelming production, a few good moments isn't enough to save this, especially when those moments are not really exceptional. So unfortunately, I'm left giving this a 6 out of 10. If this is up your alley, have fun. Again, the musicality is impressive, and I do like a lot of the drumming, but I won't be returning to this much. I reviewed Ostraka's 2023 album on my blog back in the day, and I didn't really care for it at the time, and revisiting it recently, I'd say I like it a little bit more now than I did at the time, but it's still not clicking for me like it did for a lot of critics. Then I unsurprisingly completely missed their 2025 album, but I decided to just skip over that one right now and just go straight into this new album. And right from the opening track, I can't say I was impressed, where the screams really didn't hit for me, and the production sounded really goddamn messy. honestly quite demo-like, and it's a rough way to start the album. But from there, it does get better, starting with the second track, Immiserate, which seems to be about greed and how a lot of the rich fail to think about the poor and are stuck in their own world, and the production sounds a lot better. But that doesn't mean the production doesn't have other messy moments, and the screams aren't super consistently strong in my opinion, and I also think some of these tracks sort of drag on a bit, even if the album isn't super long. Now, I do think the lyrics have some things going for them. There seems to be a theme of discussing how difficult it can be to make everyone happy and do what's best for everyone, while not avoiding calling out the people who can easily help and don't. And honestly, this goes to some pretty dark places, most notably on the closing track, which seems to show someone who's trapped and helpless with nothing to do. And in its best moments, the drums can hit quite hard, like on that closing track which I just mentioned. But again, when it's so inconsistent and often messy in a way that doesn't totally feel justified by the storytelling, even if I sort of see what they might have been trying to do by acknowledging the harsh realities of this world, I guess I just feel like I've heard things like this before, and it doesn't really feel like there's much of a point to the messiness in a way that would actually work. So while I like some parts of this album, and the instrumental track Ganymede is a nice breather moment, I still don't think I can rate this any higher than a 6 out of 10. I guess a strong 6 out of 10, but it's still not quite as good as a lot of the other heavy music that I've heard this year, of which I found quite a bit. There's quite a bit of different styles of metal that they seem to be trying to combine on this album, but I don't think they genre blend super well, and while the album is better than the opening track would imply, that's not really saying much. I've heard some good things about OK Goodnight. I didn't really know much about them, but stylistically it seems like they've been categorized as prog metal / prog rock, maybe a bit of gent with post-hardcore influence, not super heavy, but very much bordering on metal without really fully going there. And honestly, that's not a bad thing. I like my fair share of really heavy metal, especially when you consider a lot of the albums that I've really loved this year. But at least on this album, which is the only one of theirs that I've heard, OK Goodnight are more focused on melody, which is something that I really like a lot in music. I will say in post-hardcore and other adjacent genres, I usually prefer a bit more heaviness, usually it makes it a lot more impactful, but I don't really mind what OK Goodnight are aiming for here. The problem is, well, there's a lot of them. But before I get into that, I want to preface this review by acknowledging that while this album is absolutely not for me, and I honestly got pretty much nothing out of this, I do sort of see why this might be getting a lot of acclaim, and I would not immediately dismiss this album as worthless trash or anything. This record seems very focused on trying to untangle the complexities of human beings, both our actions and our emotions. And those are topics that I often find very fascinating, but this album often hints at real eye-opening commentary without really feeling like it fully does that, at least to me. It honestly feels quite forced. I also feel like it just bounces from topic to topic in its overall thematic arc, which can work, but when the commentary feels so drenched in kind of cringy metaphors and a lack of clarity without the haunting imagery that really often makes cryptic lyrics so powerful, I would have just liked maybe a bit more of an emotional core that felt more focused. It's just not resonating with me. At the same time, I would not be surprised if this was all intentional, and it honestly would make sense, because when there's so many complicated factors that contribute to moral goodness and just navigating life in general, there can be emotional resonance in just writing about how you feel without trying to assign deeper meaning to everything. And it makes sense why this might be a powerful listening experience for some. If all of that was too confusing or maybe completely missed the point of the album, because I very likely may be totally wrong about my interpretations, my similar explanation is that at the end of the day, lyrics are usually pretty subjective, as is the case with this album. It doesn't mean it's objectively bad, it's just not doing much for me at all. Lead singer Kelsey Lu literally says on The Game, "The answer is never heard as well as the question." And that might very much be the point, but it doesn't help me look past the awkwardness of the butter metaphor on the penultimate track, or be at all impressed by lines such as this one on Humpty Dumpty, "To die alone is a lonely way to go." Wow. That's amazing poetry right there. And then we gotta get to the instrumentation and production, the former of which is pretty solid. Do I find the melodies or compositions particularly captivating? Not really, but it's still very well played, and notably enough that it's worth pointing out, especially because it is one of the album's saving graces, even if it doesn't fully save it for me. And the vocals are quite impressive and really bring a venomous quality to the intensity of the record, which is fitting despite the music not being super heavy, where I can also praise the pretty sick riffs that complement the vocal delivery on The Game, which also probably has some of my favorite drumming on this record. But the production is what really holds this back for me. Why does this sound so goddamn compressed? These songs may not be blowing me away from a writing standpoint, but they could have gone a hell of a lot harder if there was more breathing room for the instrumentation to not sound so squished together in the mix. I'm not going to say there's no dynamics because that just wouldn't be true, but it certainly suffers from the same problems as albums that don't have any. Because the louder moments just don't have the impact that they should because the instruments don't complement each other much and, again, just sound squished together and compressed in the mix. That's not to say that there aren't moments that hit a bit harder, such as the pounding drums on top of the bottom, but there are so many moments where this feels underpowered and I'm not really vibing with it. So yeah, all things considered, whether or not you'll enjoy this album likely comes down to your preference of lyrical style and also whether or not you're willing to look past the issues with the production and mixing that I personally can't look past. But I'm also not a professional producer or mixer, so maybe you'll think it sounds really good. Either way, I'm not all that excited to be talking about this or even listening to it. I'll be nice and give it a light 6 out of 10, partially because it's mostly well performed, and also partially because it's listenable, but that doesn't mean that it isn't a frustrating listen. Alright, thank you for watching. I feel like I kind of mixed up my words a little bit here a lot and mumbled a little bit. So, yeah, this is probably not my best ever presentation in one of these videos, but I wanted to get this filmed. It took quite a while to write all of this because I did go a little bit more in-depth on a lot of these. Not super in-depth, of course. But anyway, I have been quite busy recently, or at least I will be quite soon, so I'm probably not going to go into as much detail in a lot of my mini reviews in upcoming videos as I did here. Again, not that I went into a ton of detail, they are mini reviews, but, you know, my next few mini review videos will probably be a little bit more, here are just some really, really quick opinions on these albums. But we'll see what happens. I'm not totally sure what my schedule is going to be like, I just know I'm going to be busy, but we'll see what I'm able to get done on this channel. Thank you so much for watching. I think that's all I got to say for now. And yeah, I'm bad at these outros, but bye.